Hi class, welcome to the lecture video for chapter 15 of Nancy Murdoch's Theories of Counseling book, where we're going to be talking about narrative therapy. Narrative therapy is something that I believe really strong in, and it's something that I didn't quite get earlier on in my career or even my time as a master's student, but as I've been working with clients and hearing story after story of addiction, depression, anxiety, family conflict, and then I start looking at human development in the years when these problems started and the initiation story of how the origin of these mental health issues began. The narrative cycle that we could learn to apply as counselors really starts to make more sense to me. So, this strategy of counseling comes from the work of Michael White and David Epston, and you can see them, together on a nice day in the picture above. But also, it uses the concepts we get from literature, fiction, myth, movies, and it casts the client in the role of being the character in that story, the narrative that they have in their life, how they see themselves in the context of the events that impact them becomes the narrative, and we get psychologically unwell or uneasy when what we're experiencing does not match our narrative, or when the narrative is actually oppressing us and holding us in a place that makes us feel uncomfortable. And so that's some of the benefit, just to start at how narrative therapy works, is we have the concept of the hero's journey, which is a concept I'm extremely fond of, and maybe isn't the focal point of narrative therapy in terms of counseling and psychology, but there is a standard cycle or a narrative, so to speak, in the myths that we tell through our movies and our books and our stories, where the hero experiences the same kinds of things, no matter what story it is, whether it's a television show like Lost, or whether it's a movie series like Star Wars or Harry Potter. And when we do an analysis of these stories, we learn about how these characters experience their problems, formulate a solution, and execute the plan to overcome evil or overcome the obstacle at their present. And so that's sort of what we're encouraging our clients to do through therapy with us. So let's go ahead and look at some slides today. You'll see on the left I've included the table of contents for The Fellowship of the Ring, which is the first book from J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. And I've included that because a lot of you may be familiar with the story, and if you do, you might get more out of this slide. But this chronicles the stages that Frodo and the Fellowship of the Ring go through in their efforts to begin their journey to destroy the source of ultimate evil, which is the Ring of Power. Now, this lecture is still designed to be on counseling theory and how we use narrative approaches with our clients, but I wanted to give a context for a character who is facing pure and ultimate evil and having the courage to do so. And that character can teach us a lot about what our clients are going through. Our clients have a problem, they're not able to overcome it, they identify that they need a plan, and so they come to us to be in the role of the mentor, sort of, to help strategize and plan, or help to give them a place to achieve catharsis and just vent about their problem in a safe space that they may not have in other areas of their life. And change is a process. It's not something that happens in chapter 1 of our story, okay? One thing that I do often, and if I can grab a book really quick, I will use this example. One thing that I do quite often is I'll take a book off the shelf and I'll say to my client, so you've read a book before, right? What's your favorite book? And they'll often pick some novel that I've at least heard of or maybe even read myself, and maybe something that's high in popularity throughout the zeitgeist of our country at the time, fandoms and whatnot. And so let's just use The Fellowship of the Ring since it's on the slide, and I'll say, okay, so think about your life like it's the book, right? What part of the book are you at? Are you at the end, like your life is about to be over and your story is about to conclude? Are you at the beginning, you're a child, and maybe you're just trying to learn things and you don't have all the information? And so they'll point at a book and they'll say, I'm about here. Like, let's say the client is in their 30s, 40s, early 50s. They'd say about here. halfway point, and then I'd say, okay, so think back on that book. What's the main character going through at that part of the story? Are they in a good space? Are they in control of their situation? Do they have the powers they need to overcome their problems? Do they know everything they need in order to find the right solution? And the answer when you're at the midpoint of a book is usually the character is just now starting to realize how big of a problem they're in. And they haven't solved it yet, because once they solve it, the book is usually over. And this is really telling for clients to think that, okay, it's all right for me not to have reached my solution point just yet. And that's what I'm trying to help them do. That doesn't mean that the solution is as complex as those fictional characters, but it's helpful to remember that life is full of struggles, and having a struggle during any given day should be expected. And we aren't expected to be a finished product yet, that we are expected to grow. We assume that we are going to acquire more knowledge and develop more talent. And counseling is a step in that direction. And with my guidance, I hope we're able to achieve some of that. So when we look at the table of contents, a lot of clients are expecting to have the kind of ending you achieve when you reach the end of the story, when they're actually in the middle of it. So take a college student who's attending counseling with me because of depression and some academic struggles. Maybe they're getting C's and D's when they think they should get B's and A's. And they only have 20 credits in the program. It's a bachelor's degree, so it's 120. And they're expecting to have this ultimately comfortable life where they achieve high in all their classes with minimal preparation, minimal studying, minimal work. And they expect to have a nice income, such as you would have when you achieve your bachelor's degree for some people, when actually they should more likely have an expectation to live the life of a college student. Narrative therapy, and just using that book example, can help them realize you're in the first quarter of your story here before you have a transformation to your situation. And sometimes we have to reel in our expectations and get to the point where we're able to pace ourselves in our expectations and understand where we fall in the true narrative of our story. Once we zoom out and we're not in the seat we're sitting in right now, we're looking from above and we're seeing the whole picture, and that I'm a part in this story, and my story is my own, but I'm also the part of other people's stories. And these stories are not finished yet. They are works in progress. Now, this slide is very important to me. This is actually a journal article that I've finished writing, and this is me applying the hero's journey to what all of you are doing here in this class with your counselor development. So I've actually taken all the research I could find on psychology, mental health counseling, social work, and marriage and family therapy that also talks about Joseph Campbell, Carl Jung, things like the hero's journey and archetypes. And I've transferred those concepts into a metaphorical bridge with what counseling students experience from the time they apply to a program, start taking their courses, reach the end of their coursework, get to know their faculty members, start their practicum and meet their supervisors, graduate with their master's and then choose to pursue licensure or maybe a doctorate, and then what it takes to sustain the growth and development in a counseling career. So from application to the program all the way to the end of the story where we retire and we leave the world a better place with people changed that we've worked with. And so right there, I'm applying narrative concepts to what every master's student, doc student, licensed counselor, intern level counselor, associate counselor, and even expert counselor and master of the field will experience. So this is something that I find very fascinating, and I just wanted to include this slide in the lecture so that maybe I can get your gears turning in a way that gets you to think, what is my narrative? What part of the story am I really in? When I feel anxiety or tension, is that anxiety or tension momentary and it will float away? Does it match the stage of the story I'm actually in? And can I learn to be accepting of it and keep my focus on the here and now where I am in this story so that I do this chapter as well as I can? So I'm exceptionally prepared for the next chapter and the next chapter and the next chapter. This career is a long story, and sometimes we get frustrated by things that are very small in the grand scheme of things. And I just wanted to share this slide with you because this is something directly from me as I seek to connect with narrative theory in our field. Now, the philosophy of this approach is that we are a constructivist philosophy working with our clients to form the narrative and frame the story that we're telling through therapy, counseling, our interventions, and our goals. We don't necessarily worry about diagnosis. We don't use the DSM-5 deliberately because of this theory. Now, if you use this theory, but you're in an organization that requires insurance billing, then you are still going to use the DSM-5. That's important to point out. But we should also point out that the philosophy of the theory does not align with just diagnosing things like major depressive disorder, or paranoid schizophrenia, or bipolar 1 disorder, or alcohol use disorder. That the story is more nuanced than just a set of behaviors in a given chapter of our story in the work that we're presenting to other people. Another thing to understand is that the social power systems from Foucault, if you're a philosophy buff, they form the frame of the story. So we are characters in the larger story of society. And so when we feel pushed down or repressed by the social power system, our story can be one that is shaped by conflict and battling for position and the ability to determine our own truth. And this is a multicultural competency point, and this is a socioeconomic point, and it's a point that permeates through all the different facets of counseling. That some people don't have the power to tell the story the way they want to tell, and that becomes their narrative. And so that's something that we may be helping them with by giving them a voice in therapy to really explore what would my narrative be if I felt empowered to tell it my way. And then that way, in a constructivist philosophy, becomes the real truth. And that right there is an excellent intervention to aim for. Another thing to realize is that we have a plot in our story, just like I showed you with my hero's journey graphic a few slides back. Is we have this idea of how our story is going to go. Some things line up exactly with the plot, and we feel comfortable in those. And other things conflict and form some dissonance, and then we have to fight through it, and we have to figure out what are the qualities of the story that align strongly with a thickness to the plot, or that there's very little supporting evidence in the story that I should be feeling the way I should. And that's an opportunity to change, really, because the narrative is giving you that opening to shape some things to the way that your perception and your motivation empower you to do so. Another thing to understand is that an outcome in one chapter could be a small step towards the outcome in a larger chapter, in a chapter more close to the resolution of the plot. And so as a person is doing counseling, they're doing baby steps each week, but the big change they're looking for, we could be building towards it the way the plot in a book builds towards the climax of the story and then the resolution of the conflict. And so this becomes the preferred story that the client is searching for. They want to achieve the resolution of conflict. And so when we start talking about life like you're a character in the story of your own life, and the conflicts are not you, it's not your depression, the enemy of your story is depression. So we're drawing out the things that we may be tempted to say are part of ourself, and we're making it something that we can combat and battle, overcome and scheme and strategize against. We are the hero trying to overcome a difficulty in perception or a conflict in our environmental world. And so when we look at the plot like it's a series of points, and we're just trying to get through 2019, or we're trying to get through the spring, and the spring is its own plot point, and with the summer we'll have new plot points, then now we're looking at our life in a way where we can improve in smaller increments, building towards the larger meaning of why we're seeking to change in the first place. So in this theory with narrative, psychology and therapy, we don't look at specific development of the individual the way we do with Piaget or maybe Freudian psychosexual stages. We look at the trajectory of the client starting right now, and we look into the past for context. So we're not going to use an Erik Erikson stage and say trust versus mistrust was the very first stage. You experienced that as an infant, and your story has cultivated a feeling of mistrust for everyone that could be a source of trust for you. Now, you could integrate Erikson into the stages if it's relevant, but ultimately this theory is not so focused on other stages that it prevents the client from forming the stages themselves with you in therapy. So another point that I have on this slide is Vygotsky's developmental theory. And these stages line up really well with how a narrative is formed. And I would encourage you to take some time to pause the slide and look up Vygotsky's developmental theory if you're not aware, or maybe pursue it in the textbook, because that can help to add some flavor and some depth to the theory itself when you're thinking about how people develop, where their motivation comes from, and how they're able to go into different phases of action across their life cycle. In terms of how health is viewed, when you're living your preferred narrative, when you're pursuing the ultimate boon, which is the culmination of your accomplishment. So earlier in my life, my preferred narrative was to finish my PhD and successfully defend my dissertation. And then I succeeded in that preferred narrative. And then my goal became to enter into the life of being a graduate level professor. And so I'm doing this video for you today. And so I accomplished that part of my preferred narrative. Other people are going to have their preferred narrative as well, whether it's graduate from college, achieve a certain job, get married, have some kids, buy a house. And when things line up with the preferred narrative, we feel healthy. When things are at odds or in conflict with the preferred narrative, we feel dysfunctional. We feel like our life experiences are against us, and we start to lose trust in our own story moving in the direction we hoped at one time that it would go. And so think about people who have a breakup with someone that they were very intimately attached to and thought they had a future with. Receiving a rejection letter from a university you really wanted to attend. Being fired from a job that you felt was very secure. These are things that form a conflict in the narrative, and it alters course. This is not the preferred way we would have wanted our story to tell. But ultimately, it's an adversity, and when we face the fear of what those messages sent to us mean, and we learn to love ourselves even in the midst of it, and move on with the story, and do damage control, collect the pieces, and reassemble the new narrative. And maybe it's not the first preferred narrative, but we can create a new preferred narrative. And once we begin accomplishing that and living on that timeline, we start to feel healthy again. And this is how counseling works with health dysfunction and the narrative that people are experiencing in their life. Another thing to remember is this is a constructivist approach to counseling with a postmodern style of execution. We aren't looking to science to understand what the truth of reality is. We're working with our client to hear them talk about what their life experience is and to form meaning from that as we work with them. We aren't just telling them how it is, although when we hear themes in the story, we can point them out and encourage the client to wrestle with them, and even give them the power to accept or reject some elements of what we think we're interpreting successfully. And that becomes part of the narrative analysis that we're doing in therapy. So we want to deconstruct a story that is problem saturated, find the themes in the behaviors and the cognitions of the person, and get the client to address those through therapy. And when we address them, maybe we can alter them, or we can put a new context on where we are in the story. And that's how we use our role of therapy in the best way available, is we get the client to begin an analysis of their own narrative and use it for good purpose. This theory utilizes several stages, 5 to be exact, of how counseling is going to begin to access the narrative and lead to change for our clients. So the first stage, and this is the most important stage in almost every theory we've covered in our class so far, is we establish the relationship. Because if we gain the trust and develop rapport and we forge that therapeutic alliance with our client, then they will trust our insight and our analysis of what we're hearing. They will wrestle with the things that we're pointing out could be in conflict with the preferred narrative. And they will turn to those ideas when they're in a tough spot and try to reconcile the difference between their initial thought and what they're truly experiencing. And that's all just because they trust you and there is a successful relationship being built there. The next stage is we elicit the problem stories, which means that we're able to hear the story of the conflict that the client's bringing into the session, and then we're able to point out contradictions or dysfunctions or incongruencies between the preferred narrative and the way the story is being told right now. And we could highlight different symptoms of depressions or anxieties the client is experiencing. We could be able to access things that are commentary of regret or resentment for different things that have occurred in their life. These become part of the narrative of the client, the way they see themselves in the world in which they exist. And when we are able to use counseling to point out the problem focus of the narrative, that encourages an analysis and interpretation from the client and the opportunity to reframe the story in a positive light where they're empowered to do good things again. So that is where we deconstruct the dominant story. This is where we're done telling the problem story and we're starting to break it down, form a synthesis and analysis. What are the healthy ideas we should keep? What are the dysfunctional ones that tear your role in your own narrative down? And then how do we recreate the dominant story into a more preferred story, which is the fourth stage. So this is the one where the character is acquiring the abilities to overcome the evil of the conflict in front of them. So the preferred story is where the client has the ability to overcome their issues and to enact positive change in their life. Once they leave the therapy room, they're able to experience positive things in their natural life, outside the place where it's just safe to talk about it, which is the therapy room. So the preferred story becomes part of life again. And once it becomes part of life, they will be living it. And when we live our preferred narrative, we accomplish our goals and then we form new goals and then we accomplish those and we enter into that positive circle where we see ourselves with high self-esteem and regard. And those are the goals of many other theories as well. Unconditional positive regard from person-centered, an effective quality life, which is an individual and existential concept. And when we live the enriched version of the story, the preferred narrative becomes reality. And that's usually when therapy, from a narrative perspective, has done its job. So when we move through the stages, you really want to focus on listening, and then you want to recast the affliction of the client as an outside character. So when I'm treating addiction, let's say I'm treating a gambling issue because that's what I'm known for, I'll be talking with the client sometimes and I'll say, okay, so the way you're describing this, it's almost like you're not talking about yourself. You're talking about the gambler, and the gambler does live inside you, but let's say that you can have a conversation with it. What do you need to say today to the gambler? And when I do that, I'm taking all of the shame of being a gambler out of the person, and I'm letting the person see it like it is the nemesis, it's the adversary, it is the opponent. And when things are the opponent, you can battle them. And isn't counseling about battling our demons and coming out with a positive change on the other end? And when you feel like your opponent is yourself, a lot of people do not do as effective engagement with it because it just leads to regret, remorse, resentment, shame, and guilt. And that's not the goal of this narrative. The narrative is to face the problem, overcome the conflict, and experience the preferred narrative where it's life itself. So this is something that we do continuously as we're listening to the client, is we're helping them to feel supported by the story that they're creating. It starts out as theirs and it's the problem narrative, but through us restorying it and helping to change the way that we frame our memories, we're creating a new version of the story, a director's cut that has a higher level of satisfaction in the person's life. And that's how the narrative can work to good effect. And this concept of talking to the gambler instead of being the gambler and turning the problem into an opponent that can be wrestled with and challenged, that is called externalizing. So when we externalize something, we're able to actually begin the journey of not just being that thing, of overcoming the thing and leaving it in our past. If we don't leave it in our past, then even when we achieve some successes, we continue to carry it with us. And so the plot is doomed to repeat itself eventually, unless you're very fortunate. And so you don't want the resistance of the problem to remain living within the identity of the client when you use this theory. You want the resistance to be left somewhere where you can remember it and have learned from it, but it isn't you and you're not still carrying it with you in every single interaction that you experience. So as you experience the journey of counseling, the counselor who's using narrative techniques may do a lot of the things that I've been talking about in this video. If you're interested in these interventions, I encourage you to review the textbook, maybe pause this slide and think about what each of these may look like, and maybe practice doing some of these in a role play with a trusted friend who's excited by your future as a counselor. They may want to do some practice conversations with you where you can work on rewriting a memory or naming the adversary through externalizing the problem, or just journaling and then analyzing the journal entry. That is a narrative technique that we can do with our clients, is encourage them to keep a daily journal of their successes and difficulties with the problems that are being faced in counseling. And so there's a lot of really important techniques on this slide right now, and you can review them and find research on them and just figure out, how do I do this in a counseling session? If you do that, then that's probably a sign that narrative therapy is interesting for you. Related to cultural diversity, the neat thing about narratives is every society, especially ones that have developed written language, they chronicle their stories and they pass them down through the generations. The desire to tell stories seems to be innate to the human condition. But one thing you need to understand is that cultures tell stories in very different ways. One thing that could be an archetypal theme in a Western European or Americanized client is going to maybe have different meaning if someone is coming from a different culture, maybe one you don't have as much interaction with or don't fully understand. And so this is why constructivist and postmodern philosophy is so important in counseling, because we just get to ask and we have our professional curiosity and we allow the client to inform us and be the expert on their own self, their own culture, and their own customs. And so just remember that. Another thing to remember is sometimes we tell our stories in ways that feminist theory can help us to do narrative counseling better, because maybe there are some themes of oppression from society, and feminist philosophy can help to clarify some things. And similarly, topics of sexual orientation in the narrative can be very challenging as well, and we want to do our best to value the person and give them the space to grow and experience their developmental stages, either in their own life or communications with others, relating to others, in a way that best matches the situation they're in and what they're ready to do. If they're not ready to do it, even if the narrative is maybe putting forth the idea in our mind that they should be ready, if they don't feel ready, they're not. And so there's still work to be done in terms of how we're classifying the chapter we are on in this story. So remember that life is a story of preferred outcomes, that it is a constructivist approach when we decide to be narrative counselors, and that dysfunction happens when the thing we're experiencing doesn't match the script of the plot we thought that we were on in our life, where the timeline is getting scattered and we're not experiencing the outcomes we had intended. The goal is to deconstruct those problem narratives and reassemble them in an empowered, self-esteem rich way that gives the client an ability to see where they truly are in the progression of their story, and be patient to complete the chapter they're on before getting ahead of themselves and persecuting themselves because they're not as far as they thought they were. Let's zoom out and look at ourselves in terms of the full narrative, that we're not done yet. And there's lots of time that we have to learn how to believe in ourselves and keep moving forward in a productive way. And as always, you want to be able to balance cultural understanding and competence to let the client show you who they are and who they are actually aspiring to be. Now, this concept, too, just one last point, is hard to research because a lot of it is up here and in our soul, so to speak. So, research is available to read about narrative therapy, but it maybe isn't as founded on numbers as things like behaviorism and cognitive behavioral therapy would be. So you have to be looking for qualitative approaches and ways to examine the narratives that people are sharing during interviews. And that's the kind of research that really lines up well with this kind of approach. So with all that being said, we have completed the video for narrative theory. I want to thank everyone for hanging in here and watching the whole video. Thank you for experiencing the end of this week of the course with me. And let's continue strong into week 8, where we wrap up and experience our last few theories and review all of the experts and masters of our field that we have learned about, so that we can get one step closer to being the master of two worlds, just like the monomyth, Campbell, archetypes from Jung, and other forms of telling the story that have come before us. Thanks, everybody.